We now come to the urgent question. Joanna Church.
Mr. Speaker, to ask the Secretary of State for the Home Department if she will make a statement on the policing of protests during the Coronation.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Coronation was a once-in-a-generation moment. A moment of national pride. A moment when the eyes of the world were upon us. A ceremony with roots over a millennium old, marking a renewed dedication to service by His Majesty the King in this new reign. Mr. Speaker, the coronation went smoothly and without disruption. I thank the 11,500 police officers on duty, alongside 6,500 military personnel and many civilians. Commissioner Mark Rowley today outlined the intelligence picture in the hours leading up to the coronation. This intelligence picture included more than one plot to cause severe disruption by placing activated rape alarms in the path of horses to induce a stampede, and a separate plot to douse participants in the procession with paint. This was the context: a once-in-a-generation national moment facing specific intelligence threats about multiple, well-organised plots to disrupt it. The police's focus was rightly on ensuring this momentous occasion passed safely and without major disruption. That was successful. All the plots to disrupt the coronation were foiled by a combination of intelligence work and proactive, vigilant policing on the ground. I would like to thank and congratulate the police for this success. At the same time, At the same time, extensive planning ensured protests could take place. This was also successful. Hundreds of protesters exercised their right to peaceful protest, including a large group numbering in the hundreds in and around Trafalgar Square. Now, where the police reasonably believed they had grounds for arrest, they acted. The latest information is that 64 arrests were made. I won't comment on individual cases or specific decisions, but the arrests included a person wanted for sexual offences, people equipped to commit criminal damage with large quantities of paint, and arrests on suspicion of conspiracy to cause public nuisance, often backed by intelligence. The Met's update last night included regret, to use their word, that 6 people arrested couldn't join the hundreds protesting in Trafalgar Square and nearby. The Met has confirmed those 6 people have now had their bail cancelled with no further action. Mr. Speaker, the police are operationally independent, and for the Met, it is primarily for the Mayor of London to hold them to account. But let's be clear. At the weekend, officers had to make difficult judgments in fast time, in a highly pressured situation against a threatening intelligence picture. I thank the police for doing that, for delivering a successful coronation, and for enabling safe, peaceful protests.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Saturday, millions of people greatly enjoyed the coronation ceremony. Others who wish to see a republic chose to protest peacefully, as is their right in a democratic society. Protests in Glasgow and Edinburgh went off without incident. However, in London, protesters who had gone to considerable lengths to liaise with the Metropolitan Police in advance of their protests and to clear both the nature and the location of the protest were detained, searched, arrested and held in the cells from 7 a.m. till after 11 p.m. All 6 of those arrested have now received letters saying there will be no further action taken against them. There were a number of other arrests of concern, but because there's no legal proceedings in respect of the 6, and therefore no reason for Parliament not to begin today to address what happened to them, I'm going to focus on them. Graham Smith, the leader of the group Republic, tells me that the arresting police showed absolutely no interest in contacting the liaison team and seemed focused on luggage straps holding placards together, which they said might be used to lock on. The Joint Committee on Human Rights has repeatedly stressed that public authorities, including the police, are under a negative obligation not to interfere with the right to protest unlawfully, and a positive obligation to facilitate peaceful protest. So why did police arrest protesters who'd gone to such great lengths to clear their protest in advance? And why did they do so on grounds which they now admit are not sufficient to charge them and without following up with the liaison team? What do citizens need to do now to clear a protest in advance? On the BBC Radio 4 Today programme, Sir Peter Fahey, the former Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, said what had happened has to be seen in the context of media, political and public pressure on the police. He referred to what he called, quotes, some pretty direct and personal feedback brought to bear on Sir Mark Rowley before the Home Affairs Select Committee on 26 April by the Honourable Member for Ashfield, and I have notified him that I had mentioned him, Mr Speaker. So, was political pressure brought to bear on the police? Sir Peter also said that the legislation, the Public Order Bill and the Policing Act is very poorly defined and far too broad, and that is what opposition MPs warned of, particularly regarding offences like locking on. So will he review the legislation and set up an inquiry into what happened to these 6 citizens on Saturday?
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable and learned member for her question. I have the greatest respect for her and will take her questions seriously. She asked about pressure. The police are, of course, operationally independent and make these decisions independently of government. Government ministers did receive briefing, particularly as the intelligence picture escalated in the 24 hours prior to the event. But the Mayor of London also received briefings, as I understand did the Shadow Home Secretary, I believe, on Friday. So there is nothing out of the ordinary in ministers receiving briefings, not least because there is a need to coordinate between the police and other agencies, both security agencies and other civilian agencies as well. In terms of legislation, this House has just debated and scrutinised at some length the legislation, and there is no plans to change that. In relation to the 6 people who were arrested and the question of protest more generally, I will just repeat the point, Mr Speaker, I made in my initial answer, that I think hundreds of people did exercise their peaceful right to protest. It was done, as the Honourable and Learned Lady said, following engagement with the Republic protest group in advance, and the fact that hundreds of people were able to peacefully protest, I think, is testament to the rights of peaceful protest. In relation to those 6 people, I don't want to get into the details of that because, frankly, neither she nor I have all the facts, but clearly, at the point the arrest was made, the police reasonably believed there were grounds to do so. But I emphasise again, for hundreds, I think several hundreds of people on that day, they were able to peacefully protest, as is their absolute right.
David Davis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Nobody should question that this was a difficult time for the Metropolitan Police, a difficult task to achieve. And nobody should question that, in a large respect, they carried it out brilliantly and gave us a marvellous occasion this weekend. That being said, within 1 week of the Public Order Bill entering the law and in its first serious use, we end up with the head of the Met having to apologise to people who were wrongfully arrested. In the event that, let us say, the Home Affairs Select Committee reviews this matter and comes back with recommendations as to how we change guidelines and maybe laws, will the Home Office take it on board?
Well, I would just caution my right honourable friend against asserting these people were wrongfully arrested. That is not an assertion that has been. That is a legal threshold, and I don't think it's been established that that legal threshold has been met. I would also, in terms of testing this legislation, I would also just draw the House's attention to the fact this was a once-in-a-lifetime event, and it took place against an intelligence backdrop which suggested there were multiple well-organised plots to cause very serious disruption, which, if they had proceeded, would have been taken very seriously by this House and been seen around the world. So I don't think one can infer from what happened at the weekend that the recently passed legislation is defective.
Now comes Shadow Minister Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The coronation of King Charles III involved the largest police effort ever undertaken. I want to thank the thousands of police officers who ensured so many people were able to enjoy such a historic occasion without incident. Rightly, in our democracy, Those police had operational responsibility and had to take decisions at pace and under pressure. And rightly, in our democracy, we also have scrutiny and accountability where problems arise. Hundreds of people who chose to do so were able to protest, and as the Minister stated, some plans to disrupt were foiled. But serious concerns have been raised about some of the arrests. The 6 people from Republic were arrested under new powers in the Public Order Act, being equipped for locking on, which came into force 2 days before the coronation. They have now been released with no further action, and the Met has expressed regret. Mr. Speaker, the Minister knows that I have warned him and his colleagues repeatedly that this new power means that people might be arrested for the wrong thing, carrying a bike lock in their bag, or, as happened in this case, some luggage straps. Many former police officers have warned that these powers put the police in a difficult position and risk undermining the notion of policing by consent. These arrests raise questions that we do want answers to. Why the arresting officers didn't know or take account that Republic had been working with the police, or why they were held for 16 hours. Does the Minister support the review by the Mayor of London so Parliament can see lessons to be learnt? And on the new public order powers, will he ask the Inspectorate and the College of Policing to monitor and review them and report back to Parliament? And will he support the recommendations in the Inspector's report for more specific training for our officers on public order? This weekend was a celebration, and one that could not have happened without the dedication of our police service. But just as important to our British democracy as our constitutional monarchy is our historic model of policing by consent, trust, and our freedom to peacefully protest. It is our job as members of Parliament to come up with laws that solve problems, not create them. So I urge the Minister opposite to learn the lessons and take responsibility for protecting that careful balance between the police and the people.
Well, look, I think it is important to maintain the balance as the Shadow Minister sets out. But as I pointed out in my opening response and my subsequent one to the honourable member opposite, the right to protest was, for those hundreds of people, protected. The protests did happen. And indeed, there is no question in principle or in any legislation that the right to peaceful protest is sacrosanct. We have, of course, in recent months seen that right to peaceful protest being stretched into acts that are deliberately disruptive, where people have sought to close down the M25, they've sought to close down the streets of London, not so much as an act of protest, but to deliberately inconvenience the public. And that is where we draw the line. At the weekend, that is broadly the same test that was being applied. Peaceful protest, of course, absolutely fine. Activity that was designed to seriously disrupt the coronation, including potentially causing a stampede of horses or covering the ceremonial procession in paint, was not acceptable. The police had to make difficult judgment. This is a unique situation. I think it probably can agree it is pretty unique. They had to make very difficult decisions in very fast time against an extremely threatening intelligence picture. Often the facts were, at the time, unclear. That is very difficult. I think all of us here should just accept those are difficult decisions. And I think the police, obviously, it's for them to answer operationally, but they, if they were here, would say they acted lawfully to the best of their reasonable belief at the time. But I do want to put on record the right to peaceful protest is sacrosanct, and I'm sure no one in this House on either side would ever seek to undermine it.
Thank
you very much, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister agree with me that as a matter of law, the fact of the matter is that the police are entirely within their rights to arrest individuals to prevent a crime? It happens somewhere in the country pretty much every day. They obviously do not have to wait until a crime is actually committed, the active offence is committed, before acting. If they knew an armed robbery was about to take place from intelligence received, they don't have to wait until that armed robbery is taking place before acting, and the same applies here. Does the Minister agree with me that the police did an excellent job in very difficult circumstances, and this is a government that supports the police? We will leave the opposition parties to support those who do not follow the law. And the fact of the matter is, in extremely difficult circumstances, they did a good job.
Oh, can I just remind you, we're not at the bar now. You've got shorter questions. Come on, Minister.
Look, I thank my right honourable and learned friend for his question. Yes, I do agree the police did a good job in what were very difficult, fast-moving circumstances where judgments were inevitably difficult. It is easy to criticise after the event, but I think the police did a good job in what were extremely trying and difficult circumstances.
SNP spokesperson Anderson to us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The UN Commissioner for Human Rights has said that the Public Order Act is incompatible with the right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association. It is deeply disappointing to hear Labour and the Conservatives now both wedded to this legislation that undermines our right to protest. Graham Smith, the CEO of Republic, has said that these arrests are a direct attack on our democracy and the fundamental rights of every person in the country. He further says the right to protest peacefully in the UK no longer exists. Instead, we have a freedom to protest that is contingent on the political decisions made by ministers and senior police officers. That is entirely unacceptable. And in reading Sir Mark Rowley's statement that he has put out, he says, having reviewed the evidence and potential lines of inquiry, we do not judge that we will be able to prove criminal intent beyond all reasonable doubt. So these arrests were not necessary. And further, Sir Mark Rowley says he supports the officers' actions in this unique, fast-moving operational context, which means that if similar circumstances occurred, there is no certainty that this would not just happen again. So will the Minister tell me further what protections people can expect when they, in good faith, engage with authorities before protest to prevent this kind of thing happening, to find it happen again? And is he concerned that a journalist was amongst those arrested?
Well, it is entirely inaccurate to say the right to protest does not exist. As I pointed out, hundreds and hundreds of people did peacefully and lawfully protest on Coronation Day. They did so unmolested and unimpeded, which I think goes to show this idea that the right to protest doesn't exist, it doesn't exist anymore, is absolute nonsense. What does not exist is the right to cause disruption to other members of society. That is what our laws seek to prevent. And in relation to the Human Rights Act, and particularly Articles 10 and 11 of the ECHR, there's been the recent Public Order Act had a Section 19(1)A statement on the front of it, saying that legal analysis finds it is compatible. And if the Honourable Lady studies Articles 10 and 11, and particularly the second paragraphs of those, she will see they are balanced rights, balanced with the qualified rights, which are able to be balanced against the right of democratically elected legislatures to legislate to prevent criminal activity, including disruption.
Dempster.
Very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend agree with me that the Metropolitan Police did a great job here? They took the necessary action to protect the public during a unique state event, and not one word of what we've heard opposite or anything that's going to come will be able to give any evidence to the country in respect of that. It is reassuring that for once the Metropolitan Police acted on the side of the hard-working public who want to have the opportunity to enjoy events rather than being the victims of left-wing protest groups.
Minister.
I agree with my honourable friend.
Chair of the Select Committee, Dame Diana Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, and can I add my thanks to those involved in the arrangements for the coronation and keeping the public safe. However, I think the Home Affairs Select Committee will no doubt want to look at the policing of protests at the coronation, and in particular the specific provisions in the Public Order Act brought in just last week and used to arrest members of Republic. We've heard a lot about operational independence of the police this afternoon, so can the Minister just explain why the Home Office's Police Powers Unit on the 27th of April sent an official letter to Republic ahead of the coronation? Now, of course, Republic have no history of locking on. I just want to know how many other organisations received these letters, what other groups received them, and on what basis they were sent these letters, and whether this practice will now be the norm for the Home Office.
Minister.
Well, any such letters, I don't believe, were sent in my name, so I can't comment on who may have received them. I suspect, although I'm not certain, that these related to clarifying the new statutory provisions that were recently brought into effect through the Public Order Act 2023. The operational independence of the police is important because Parliament legislates, and it is then for the police to apply those laws without fear or favour, and they did so on this occasion.
Sir Desmond Swain.
There's been a misunderstanding, clearly. Despite the police doing a brilliant job, that's why there's been an apology. But wouldn't the Minister expect that misunderstanding to have been resolved well within the 16 hours for which the 6 were incarcerated? And surely there should be some questions asked about that.
Well, again, exactly what happened is an operational matter for the police. Clearly, on that day, Saturday just gone, the police had a lot going on in central London, policing the largest public event that we have ever had in our country's history. I don't know, and in fact no member of this House knows or can know precisely what inquiries were being undertaken while the decision ultimately to release those individuals was taken. But of course there are complaint processes available. If any individual member of the public wants to follow them, they're available to anyone who is arrested or indeed who encounters the police. And if someone feels the police have behaved in a particular situation unreasonably, they are able to use those complaint procedures.
Richard Berger.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't it the case that the arrests we saw of peaceful protesters at the weekend weren't an aberration, but were exactly what the Public Order Act is designed to do, to clamp down on legitimate peaceful protest, which should be a basic democratic right in this country?
No, that is not the purpose of the Public Order Act. The Public Order Act is designed to prevent people deliberately disrupting the daily lives of their fellow citizens, which we have seen with locking on public highways, causing enormous traffic jams, stopping people getting to hospital, stopping people getting their children to school, people being unable to get to work. We've seen 10-mile tailbacks on the M25, and we had specific intelligence that people planned to disrupt the coronation by creating a stampede of horses and covering the ceremonial procession in paint. The Public Order Act 2023 is designed to stop that kind of disruption, while of course allowing peaceful protest. That is its purpose.
Louis French.
Mr. Speaker, and I feel, given some of the heat of the debate, I must add that as a Greater London MP, it's complete and utter nonsense that you can no longer peacefully protest in London. I myself attended my first ever protest a couple of weeks ago, where I was protesting against the Mayor of London's disgraceful ULEZ, and we were left to peacefully protest. But does my honourable friend agree that the police and our armed forces, those 11,500 police officers and armed forces, did an excellent job over the weekends to police and keep the public safe during the fantastic coronation celebrations?
Well, look, I think my honourable friend puts it very well. I join him, by the way, in opposing Sadiq Khan's appalling ULEZ idea. But on the coronation policing, yes, they did a great job. I think there were almost 30,000 officers deployed at one time or another during the relevant period between the Met Force area and Thames Valley for the Windsor concert the following day. There were, I think, 11,500 deployed on the day of the coronation itself, in addition to 6,500 armed forces personnel. We also, by the way, had 312 protected people coming into the country from around the world. And we had, I think, almost 1,000 close protection officers deployed as well. All of those officers did a fantastic job in what was, I think, a moment of national pride for all of us.
Mr. Carmichael.
Mr. Speaker, can I just say to the Policing Minister, I'm a little bit surprised that he should apparently accept without question the proposition that the Metropolitan Police now apologises to people who have been lawfully arrested. Even by his standards, that's something of a novel departure. But the Public Order Act has given police officers very broad and sweeping powers, which in turn requires the police to exercise discretion and judgment with no context or guidelines. And a consequence, if there is no change to this legislation, things like this will keep happening. There should have been better pre-legislative scrutiny of this Act. There wasn't. Will he now commit to giving us post-legislative scrutiny of it?
Well, I mean, of course, many pieces of legislation require on-the-ground interpretation, whether by the police or subsequently by the courts in case law. Indeed, the precise definitions contained in this new piece of legislation, the Public Order Act 2023, include things like much more precise definitions of what constitutes serious disruption, which was previously extremely ambiguous. And that clarity is something which the police and others had called for. In terms of scrutiny, obviously the House is welcome to conduct scrutiny whenever it wants. I think as a matter of standard, new bits of legislation are subject to post-leg scrutiny sometime later. But actually in many areas, this new Act of Parliament, recently taken effect or recently gained royal assent, provides additional specificity, clarity and precision that was previously lacking.
The Minister said rightly that hundreds of people protested against the once-in-a-generation coronation. Hundreds of thousands of people were present to actually celebrate the coronation, while millions in the United Kingdom and around the world watched it. I'm getting pretty fed up, actually, with the police apologising all the time. I can say that ordinary police officers doing a decent job, as they did on Saturday, find their morale is at rock bottom when they're given the instruction, "We will deal robustly with anyone intent on undermining this celebration," which came from the Met Police on the 3rd of May, and then finding that someone is apologising for them doing just that.
Well, I think the Metropolitan Police Commissioner had an article in today's Evening Standard which very robustly sets out the background and defends the police's approach to the coronation. And in fact, if any member of the House has not yet read that Evening Standard article, I think it was published earlier today, and I'd strongly recommend members on both sides to read it. I think the comment he refers to specifically was an expression of regret that those 6 people were unable to join the hundreds of others who were peacefully protesting. Now, the hundreds of others were exercising their right to peaceful protest, as they are perfectly entitled to do, but it is worth mentioning in passing, as my honourable friend has just done, they were in a tiny, tiny, tiny minority, but that does not in any way undermine their right to protest if they choose to.
Clive Lewis.
Mr. Speaker, I think it looks terribly obvious to anyone that looks at this that if you take a piece of draconian legislation like the Public Order Bill, pass it through, rush it through this place via an unelected head of state who gave it consent, hand it to a failing institution like the Metropolitan Police, who then decapitate the leadership of the Republican protest movement. What do you expect? This piece of legislation is doing exactly what it says on the tin. It's stopping peaceful protest.
That is absolute nonsense. This legislation is preventing disruption to the lives of our fellow citizens. I wholly repudiate the suggestion it was rushed through. There was extensive ping-pong, which I do not recall the honourable gentleman turning up to if he was so concerned about scrutiny. And as for his comment about the process for a bill gaining royal assent, I will not dignify that with a response.
John Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Personally, I can't think of almost a greater waste of time in an inquiry into this. I think the police did a fantastic job over the weekend. I think they took actions under pressure. They had to make decisions quickly to ensure that a great national event went ahead without any kind of negative event, and that was true. And I'm very glad that happened. Does the Minister agree, share with me some of the concerns that some of the Just Stop All protests think they might have found a bit of a loophole in the Public Order Act and actually think they can get away with slow marching? Will the Minister assure me this isn't the case and that we don't continue to see Just Stop All protests cause havoc in our towns?
Well, Just Stop Oil have adapted their tactics since they blocked the M25 back in, I think, November and caused 10-mile tailbacks, following which a number of arrests were made, some of whom were, in fact, then remanded into custody. They have now changed their tactics with these slow-walking tactics, but the police are now applying cumulative disruption tests to that, using Section 12 of the 1986 Public Order Act, and they are making notices under that Act. And recent disruptions in the last sort of 10 to 14 days have seen the roads cleared typically within less than 10 minutes, which I'm sure Londoners, my constituents and others will welcome very strongly.
Caroline Lucas.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister just said that the right to peaceful protest is sacrosanct and that no one would seek to undermine it. But I would put it to him that that is exactly and precisely what his government has just done. Ministers are criminalising protest. And just because some people were allowed to go ahead and protest does not mitigate against the fact that a number of them were not. And if I could just correct the Minister, those who were arrested and kept in were not causing an obstruction, which is presumably exactly why the police then went to apologise to them afterwards. So doesn't this show that the powers the government has handed to the police are dangerously broad, liable to gross misuse, as many of us have pointed out, and can I urge him again to urgently review this piece of legislation?
No, I don't accept that analysis. The powers are designed to prevent disruption where it might occur or where it is occurring. That includes things like locking on, which we have seen cause huge disruption on the streets of London. The law allows peaceful protest where it's not disruptive and where people do not plan to cause disruption, and that is why hundreds and hundreds of people, albeit a tiny minority of the total, were able to peacefully protest. Where someone is preparing to commit or is committing a criminal offence, like disrupting a procession, it is reasonable for the police to act.
John MacDonald.
As the Secretary of the NUJ Parliamentary Group, throughout the passage of the public order legislation, I asked for and was given by ministers assurances that this legislation would not impede upon journalistic freedoms. And yet on Saturday we saw at least one journalist stopped and searched, nothing found, handcuffed, his credentials torn off him, and then detained for 16 hours, a member of BEC2, a professional filmmaker. Could I ask the Minister now to investigate why the assurances this House was given on media freedom were not adhered to?
Minister.
Yeah, well, the new bill does contain a specific clause which was, I think, added during its passage, protecting journalistic freedoms. I think if there is and in fact, there was an incident in Hertfordshire a few months ago, I think it was in November, when a journalist was incorrectly arrested, and the relevant police force, Hertfordshire in that case, apologised subsequently. The government did then legislate in the recent bill. As I say, there is a specific clause protecting journalistic freedom. I don't want to comment on an individual operational matter, not least because neither he nor I have the full facts, but as I said already, there is a complaints process, and if an individual or others feel they weren't fairly or properly treated, they do have a complaints process they can go through. But Parliament has made its view clear.
Alan Dorrans.
Mr. Speaker, good afternoon. Does the Minister agree with the former Greater Manchester Police Chief Sapir Fahy, who has extensive experience of public order policing, who previously described the Public Order Act as poorly defined and far too broad, and who added this weekend that we are now seeing the consequences of that?
Minister.
No, I don't agree, and I've already explained why.
Nadia Whittam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister has repeatedly used the example of hundreds being able to protest as evidence that our right to protest isn't undermined. But when people can be preemptively arrested on the flimsiest of pretences and then be thrown in a police cell for the best part of 24 hours, how can he reassure people who are attending a protest or even walking near a protest that the same thing won't happen to them? How can he claim that our right to protest isn't being undermined by his government?
Minister.
Well, I've mentioned the ECHR compatibility, particularly in relation to Articles 10 and 11. Before the police can arrest anyone, they do have to have a reasonable grounds for suspicion that an offence has been committed. Obviously, individual operational decisions, in this case relating to 6 people, are something that can be looked into subsequently if that is necessary. But the bill itself, the Public Order Bill, as passed by Parliament, does nothing to criminalise lawful protest. And as I've said, hundreds and hundreds of people did exercise exactly that right, although they were in a tiny minority.
Justin Mathers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's no doubt the police have a difficult job to do, making swift on-the-ground judgments, but I think that their job is made harder when they don't act in a consistent manner. Now, I've had an eyewitness account that a protester was allowed to go in amongst the Republicans for about 10 minutes unchallenged, jostling them, acting in a provocative manner, right in front of the police before the police actually intervened. There's no doubt that was disruption, but the police didn't act for quite a long time there. So does he agree that actually that sort of thing creates the impression that some types of protest are more equal than others?
Yeah.
Well, I haven't heard that particular account before, so I don't think it's really appropriate to comment on something I've just heard about across the floor of the chamber. But I've already drawn the House's attention to the procedures that are available to members of the public. But I do appreciate his opening comment that the police did have a very difficult job. They were under enormous pressure. They were dealing with a number of intelligence threats that I outlined at the beginning of my response. Things were moving very quickly. Often the picture was confusing. And things had to be done often in a rush. So I do appreciate his acknowledgement of the very difficult job the police had to do, but I think they rose to the occasion.
Wendy Chim.
Thank
you, Mr Speaker. Now, I voted against this bill and legislation at every stage, but as a former police officer from Bill Committee stage onwards, I highlighted training, the capacity and capability of police officers to be able to exercise their powers so that those dynamic pressures that the Minister just referred to can actually be dealt with appropriately. So can the Minister advise how many officers were trained in relation to this legislation prior to attending the coronation on Tuesday? How many of them, at what rank, and what does the training consist of?
Well, obviously, many officers do have specialist public order training. The overall gold commander for the event is one of the Metropolitan Police's most experienced public order commanders at the rank of commander. Many officers have had specialist public order training, as I say, in the course of their career. But it is important to make sure that, particularly as legislation changes, the training keeps up with it. And I know the College of Policing and others will be issuing the relevant guidance to make sure that is addressed.
Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Minister agree with me that the Metropolitan Police's admission of regret regarding their arrest of 6 anti-monarchy protesters this weekend is an admission of guilt? And does he accept that this is a chilling violation of basic democratic rights and demonstrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Public Order Act should be immediately repealed?
Yeah. No, I don't agree.
Kirsty Oswald.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I think that the Minister has a real brass neck. The Tory government have brought in this most draconian legislation, and then he's in here telling us that the police are operationally independent of the government, as if it's absolutely nothing to do with their actions. The Human Rights Watch have said that what we saw was something that you'd expect to see in Moscow, not London. And I wonder if he would agree with me that given that only reportedly 6% of those who were arrested for protesting against the coronation were actually charged with anything at all, that this new legislation is absolutely nothing but an advert for how to impede people's right to protest.
Well, I must say, with great respect, I think that is nonsense. And comparing the policing of the coronation with Putin's Moscow or Putin's Russia, where opposition figures are incarcerated, people like Alexei Navalny in prison, suffering the most appalling and inhumane treatment. I think it's, frankly, a bit of an insult to the appalling treatment they are suffering to in any way compare what is happening there to the policing of the coronation. I don't think it is at all respectful to those being oppressed in Russia at all. And, you know, in terms of peaceful protest, hundreds of people did peacefully protest against the monarchy. It was a tiny minority, but they did protest. The police only made those arrests, 64 arrests in total, where they had reasonable grounds to believe a criminal offence had been committed or was in preparation. And if anyone feels that the arrest they experienced wasn't proper or appropriate, there are mechanisms they can use to complain and to seek redress.
Mr
Speaker, I appreciate this was an exceptionally challenging weekend for the police, but I'm particularly concerned about the arrest and detention of members of the Westminster Night Stars team, who are volunteers out in central London helping to keep people safe. Now, communication between local authorities and the police and other agencies is absolutely critical. So can the Minister assure me that he will find out what happened, what went wrong in this communication, and to be sure that lessons are learnt to make sure that when volunteers were out supporting the police in their work, they do not get arrested because of a breakdown in such communication?
Minister.
Yes, I think that is a matter which, first of all, I agree with her that the communication between local authorities and police is very important, and that join-up needs to happen. I think the question she has asked is probably best directed via the Police and Crime Commissioner for the Mayor of London, who I'm sure will be happy to take up the query.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. No one wished the new Commissioner of the Met success more than London MPs whose constituents had suffered from a catalogue of institutional harm under his predecessors. But his statement in the Standard today is political somersaulting from start to finish, including justifying arrests because celebrating crowds were applauding and cheering them. Isn't this a direct result of the undue pressure put on the Commissioner by a Conservative Party that increasingly picks and chooses when it follows the rule of law?
Minister.
Well, I don't accept that. I've already pointed out the operational independence of the police, and I've also said that briefings by the Met on the coronation were received not just by Home Office ministers, but also by the Shadow Home Secretary and by the Mayor of London, all of which was completely proper.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The whole world could see on Saturday the effects of this public order legislation on policing trying to prevent legitimate peaceful protest in a democracy. Will he reply in a considered and reasonable way of an undertaking to undertake a full review of the operations of the public order bill thus far on preventing peaceful protest in this country as an example of how democracy is prepared to admit it's got something wrong and is prepared to change it?
No, what we saw on Saturday was the police doing their best in very difficult and challenging circumstances to prevent disruption occurring while allowing and facilitating peaceful protest, which indeed went ahead and happened.
Douglas Chapman.
Mr. Speaker, there's an unwritten law in Scotland where the best policing is carried out when it's done with the consent of the public. What is it about the Met that, when it comes to public events, the policing is heavy-handed and often completely wrong in its tone? Would the Minister agree with me that when such an approach becomes part of the policing approach, does that not undermine public confidence in the police itself? And will he review urgently basic training needs at the Met? And does this government diktat through the public order bill, does that not get in the way of good policing?
Look, I mean, training is very important, as his honourable friend mentioned a little while ago. But once again, I don't think what we saw was an unreasonable or indeed any trampling on the right to protest. We saw hundreds of people exercising their right to protest. But I would also just urge the House to keep in mind this was a unique event. This was a once-in-a-generation event. The eyes of the world were upon us. There were numerous intelligence reports that I was briefed on, and perhaps the Shadow Home Secretary was briefed on as well, indicating well-developed plots to disrupt the coronation, and the policing response to this needs to be considered in that context.
Beth Winter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the arrests of peaceful pro-democracy campaigners on the route to the coronation on Saturday, the security ministers claimed that the weekend would, and I quote, showcase our liberty has fallen flat. Can the Minister please explain why it was the Home Office and not the Metropolitan Police who wrote what protest groups have referred to as intimidatory letters about the public order powers? And can he please provide a comprehensive explanation as to why journalists are now being arrested when Section 17 of the Public Order Act prohibits this?
Yeah, well, on the question of the letters, as I said earlier, those were not sent, as far as I can recall, in my name. They may well have been attempting to be helpful by clarifying recently enacted legislation which some groups may not have been familiar with, and it's not unreasonable to try and make sure relevant parties do know when the law changes. In relation to journalistic freedom, as she says, this House and the government, supported by the government, voted to particularly and specifically protect journalists, and that is the right thing to do. If anyone feels that hasn't been properly implemented, there are complaints procedures available.
Daisy Cooper.
Mr. Speaker, amongst those arrested on Saturday was Rich Felgate, a documentary filmmaker who identified himself as a journalist, claims that a police officer ripped off his press credentials before he was then arrested and detained. The Minister will know that Rich was one of 4 journalists and filmmakers who were arrested and detained in or near my constituency in Hertfordshire last November. It is incomprehensible to me that after the outcry last November, police forces can still keep getting the basics wrong when it comes to protecting the freedom of the press and the right of journalists to do their jobs. So will the Minister look again at this legislation, and will he please consider again the proposal for a statutory duty on police to facilitate peaceful protest and the proposal for a code of conduct so the police and protesters know where they stand?
Well, as I've said 2 or 3 times already, the new Public Order Act does contain a clause, I think the honourable member opposite suggested a moment ago it was clause 17, which specifically protects journalistic freedom. If there are, and that of course followed the incident in Hertfordshire, it was after the incident in Hertfordshire, if there are particular examples, particular individual cases where the new law and indeed the wider ECHR right and common law right for journalists is not being applied, there are complaints mechanisms, but this House, supported by the government, has legislated specifically to protect journalistic freedoms.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given
what happened to these 6 individuals on Saturday who were clearly not involved in any plot to use rape alarms or paint to disrupt the coronation. Otherwise, why have the police apologised to them? What confidence can the organisers of any future protests have that what they have been told in advance planning meetings with the police will actually be capable of being relied upon on the day?
Well, I believe, again, without wanting to go into too many specifics, I believe the police's assessment at the time didn't relate in this particular case to rape alarms or to paint, but to locking on equipment. The right honourable member opposite says it is clear, but of course many things are clear with hindsight. Things are sometimes less clear in the heat of a live operation. In terms of assurance around the right to protest, the Public Order Act does not in any way infringe or undermine the right to protest, and indeed we saw on Saturday quite a reasonable-sized, a few hundred people protesting at the Coronation event without any impediment, and we see Just Stop Oil protesters these days protesting on an almost daily basis. So there is evidence in front of us showing us how the right to protest unfolds on a near daily basis.
Brendan O'Hara.
On Saturday, we saw Metropolitan Police officers pre-arresting people whose only offence was to want an elected head of state. Despite their planned peaceful protest being pre-authorised, UK citizens who had committed no crime whatsoever were taken off the streets and detained simply because of their political beliefs. But isn't this exactly how this anti-democratic, draconian, authoritarian piece of legislation was designed to work? And isn't it proof, Minister, that this is what makes this legislation so dangerously wrong?
Minister.
No, the legislation does not in any way criminalise or prevent protests. We see protests happening on a daily basis, including on Saturday. What the legislation does is enables the police to prevent disruption. They need to have a reasonable belief in order to do that. If anyone feels that in this very small minority of cases, tiny minority of cases, those powers were misapplied, then there are complaints procedures. But the vast majority of people wishing to protest on Saturday did so.
Carol Monaghan.
Deputy Speaker, can the Minister confirm whether the right to peaceful protest only applies if the individual's views chime with the government's own?
Minister.
I mean, I'm not really sure that question merits an answer. I mean, legislation is clearly politics agnostic, and it's for the police to apply it without fear or favour.
Mick Whitley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Minister accept that the troubling scenes witnessed during the coronation vindicate that those of us on this side of the House who own the government's new anti-process laws would be used to stifle dissent and limit freedom of expression? And will he accept that if we are to protect the most fundamental right of free speech, then the Public Order Bill must be scrapped in its entirety?
No, as I've said repeatedly, the Public Order Act and associated legislation is designed to prevent disruption to our fellow citizens' day-to-day lives while enabling peaceful protest.
Martin Doherty Hughes.
Let me congratulate the member for Edinburgh South West for actually gaining this urgent question today, Madam Deputy Speaker. The seemingly random nature with which the Metropolitan Police can apply the law only to fully exonerate those arrested soon after is itself akin to something one might see in an illiberal democracy like Hungary or Turkey. And all this just a week after the Security Minister themselves stood at the dispatch box there and said that the coronation was a chance to showcase our liberty. So does the Minister agree with their colleague? Are these arrests a showcase of British liberty?
Minister.
Well, I think the fact that hundreds of people protested against the monarchy, albeit they were a tiny minority of the crowds, demonstrates the right to protest is unfettered. The fact that I suspect as we speak there are Just Stop Oil protesters somewhere in London, no doubt up to their protesting activities as we have this discussion here in Parliament. So I think the right to protest is sacrosanct. It is protected, not least by the ECHR, but also by our domestic legislation. That is something we should all be pleased about.
Peter Grant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister has repeatedly told us today that there was evidence of, in his words, a well-developed plot to misuse activated rape alarms in a way that would clearly have been criminally reckless and which no one could condone. Given that that plot was so well developed, and with the exception of the 3 Night Stars volunteers that have been referred to already, can the Minister tell us, of all the people arrested, how many of them were found to be in possession of rape alarms? How many of them have been charged with intent to use those rape alarms for criminal purposes? How many rape alarms have been seized on Saturday? And if the answer to all of those questions is nil or next to nil, will the Minister accept that in this case the police intelligence was badly and dangerously misinformed?
No, well, I think there is an update on all of the arrests on the Metropolitan Police's website, which will provide some of the information the Honourable Gentleman asks for. Some arrests were made on the ceremonial, close to the ceremonial footprint, including people that had large quantities of paint. Other arrests were made at locations away from the ceremonial footprint at what might be described as a safe house. The briefings that certainly I received from the Met the night before, and I believe the Mayor of London received, and possibly the Shadow Home Secretary as well, I'm not sure, indicated multiple well-developed and credible plots to materially disrupt the coronation, and I think it is greatly to the Metropolitan Police's credit that they prevented those from unfolding.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Participating as I have in protests across Northern Ireland, all peaceful protests in the politics of Northern Ireland, I think I recognise that government is trying to ensure that peaceful protests can take place. The Coronation weekend has been a globally celebrated event, and something that the United Kingdom will look back over many years to come with pride. And the 64 arrests that were made were in relation to, I understand, intelligence that suggested that there would be deliberate attempts to cause nuisance on Coronation Day. Will the Minister join me in thanking the Met Police, as opposed to critiquing them for carrying out their duties in a swift manner, to enable people to celebrate the coronation of His Majesty the King in peace and without disruption?
Minister.
Yes, I would like to join my honourable friend in thanking the police and the armed forces personnel and the civilians involved in laying on the coronation for a successful and ultimately peaceful event, despite the plots that were uncovered in advance. I'd like to, also thank the police for ensuring that those protests were able to take place. It's an event, I think, overall, that this country can be proud of. I'm sure all of us want to wish King Charles III well at the beginning of his new reign and say, God save the King.
Yeah.